Welcome back to the Redwood River Table Part 2. The image you see now is what the final table is going to look like. So what we're doing here is sealing the surface of the slabs to help prevent air bubbles. And we've placed the slabs into the mold and built up the mold around it so it's ready to go. But before you can pour, you have to level the table. My first thought was to shim up the mold, but I realized that might actually warp it. And then I had the idea of jacking up the entire workbench. The garage floor has a slight slope to it, so using a car jack, I was able to lift up one corner of the workbench and bring it to perfectly level. And here we are doing a level check. And this is what I had to put under the wheels of the workbench to bring it to level. The final table is going to be a seashore theme, and the idea was to lay in seashells into the riverbed. And so my wife and I were doing some tryout of different shells. So we're ready to mix epoxy. Since this is the first time I've mixed such large quantities of epoxy, I was really worried about not adequately mixing, so I mixed the heck out of it and poured it back and forth in the bubbles, in the buckets several times. Now I'm putting it into the vacuum chamber to degas it. Vacuum chamber works by lowering the pressure, which causes the bubbles in the epoxy to expand, and when they expand they become more buoyant, and so they float to the surface. Here I'm pouring in 0.7 liters of epoxy directly into the mold without the slabs present. My idea was I didn't want the pigmented epoxy to flow underneath the table, and I got the idea, why don't I just pour a little bit of epoxy into the mold and then lay in the slabs, and that will cause the bottom of the slabs to be on top of clear epoxy. And it has the added benefit that this 1/4 inch, or actually more like 1/8 of an inch of clear epoxy will flow around the edges of the mold and seal up any leaks. And when the epoxy cures, if there's any leaks in the mold, they'll be plugged up. And as it turns out, there was a small leak, and a little bit of epoxy leaked out, just a few drops, and then it cured and sealed up the hole. Now I'm brushing epoxy onto the bottom 1 inch of the 2-inch thick slabs. I intentionally just did the bottom 1 inch because when I poured the next layer, I wanted it to have tacky epoxy to stick to, and the next layer is only going to be about 1 inch thick, even though the slabs are 2 inches. Before clamping the slabs down, I have to make sure they're in exactly the right position for the shape of my table. It's 77 inches long and about 33 inches wide. Getting ready for the clamps. Those blocks are wrapped in Tyvek tape and cellophane. I added the cellophane because in a test run I found that some of the adhesive underneath the Tyvek tape got onto the redwood, and when I took the block away I had this residue of adhesive, and so to avoid that from happening again, I additionally wrapped them in saran wrap. I know from prior experience that epoxy does not stick to saran wrap. This video is running at about 3x speed to speed things along. I don't actually walk that fast. There's a little bit of leakage right there. Right under the K in Tyvek, you can see a little bit of epoxy got out, but then it cured like that and plugged up the hole. So when I did the big river pour, which we're doing right now, there was no leakage. It took about 5 gallons of blue tinted epoxy to fill the river, so it took 2 bucket loads. There's a 1/4 inch of space around the edges of the mold. My plan is to leave it that. Oh, right after I poured the river, a moth flew into the garage and landed in the river. Fortunately, I was able to pick it out. Now making some swirls in the river. I would do this several times over the course of the day. You make these beautiful swirls and then they kind of fade away and you have to do it again. This is a mix of Pacific blue and a kind of a sky blue plus pearl white, and also a little bit of phosphorus glow powder, so the river slightly glows in the dark. Here's some shots of the swirls that I made, but the final result didn't look like that. Now we're laying in the shells. Funny story, this is the initial application of the seashells, and it turns out we were a few hours too early. Some of the shells started sinking and I had to pull them out, and we waited till the next morning and put them back. That coral on the left is quite thick, so it's actually pushed all the way through the river and is sitting on the bottom of the mold. And I later sprinkled some phosphorus powder into the coral, so at night that coral lights up in the dark. My wife is helping me with placement of the shells. She's the artistic one. Now it's time for the clear pour. So the bottom 1 inch of the river is the blue, and then the shells were added to that, and now I'm going to pour crystal clear epoxy over that. But the first step is to get the gas bubbles out, and I put my camera on top of the window looking into the gas chamber, and this is time-lapse video showing the bubbles rising to the surface, turning to foam, and then rapidly popping. And you see clear epoxy underneath. So here comes the clear river pour. Filling the river with clear, this liquid glass epoxy is just super clear. You can't even tell it's there. It's just absolutely beautiful. I was really happy with it. And using the torch here to take out the bubbles that occurred from the epoxy being poured. Look at that. There's an inch of clear and you can't even see it. A little gnat landed in and I managed to pick it out. that wasn't the only one. There'd be another later on. Now this is the next day, removing the clamps. They no longer needed. Look at the reflection on the river of the window in the background. It's just so clear. And as I explained before, there was no leakage out of the mold, thanks to the small pour I did at the beginning that sealed up the leaks. Now we're degassing again for the flood pour. The table is made out of 2-inch thick slabs of redwood, and redwood is a very soft wood. Look at those bubbles rising to the surface. Yeah. Redwood is very soft, and we want to use this as a dining table, and I was worried that somebody might, jab a fork or something into it, and because redwood is so soft, the fork would penetrate into the wood and just cause damage. So I decided to armor the redwood with a 1/4 inch of epoxy. So I did a flood pour over the whole thing. And this, I realized later, wasn't really necessary. The epoxy was going to get there anyway, but just spread it around to the corners. And now the entire surface of the table is covered with a 1/4 inch of liquid glass clear deep pour epoxy. So pretty. Those are reflections of the windows in the background there. Funny thing is, there was a couple places where air started bubbling out of the wood, and this air would continue to bubble for 12 hours. Finally, after 12 hours, either the epoxy thickened up enough or it ran out of air in the wood and it stopped bubbling. I popped the bubbles with a torch. I actually was kind of happy to have that air bubbling out because that meant epoxy was going in. So the cavities in the wood were being filled with epoxy, which is just as well. And here's the table as it stands now, end of part 2.